I'm John Day, and I'm here to introduce a selection of readings about the human side of the quarry industry on Cape Ann. Quarrying on Cape Ann grew up in parallel with the fishing industry in the 19th and early 20th century. There were over 60 quarries, some very big and some quite small, the small ones often called motions. The majority of these quarries eventually came to be owned by the Rockport Granite Company. The need for quarry workers exceeded the local supply, attracting immigrants from Canada, Ireland, Sweden, Scotland, Italy, and especially Finland. Quarry work was dangerous work, noisy, dusty, and hazardous to life and limb. The quarrying companies owned their own railroads, derricks, drills, pumps, and fleets of ships, including schooners, to ship their product to Salem, Boston, Providence, Connecticut, New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., Virginia, Cuba, and Chile. Cape Ann granite, in gray, green, or red, was used for foundation stones, bridges, monuments, seawalls, dry docks, churches, banks, memorials, and most especially paving stones. Look around Rockport and you'll see many granite public buildings, and there are some in Gloucester too. The industry came to an end with labor unrest in the 1920s and the supplanting of paving stone by asphalt for the nation's streets and highways. Our readers tonight will share passages from a variety of works: memoir, poem, novel, oral histories, a children's book. 3 of the passages, the first, the last, and one of the ones in the middle, are from Jonathan Bayliss's Gloucester book. And our program this evening will conclude with a slideshow considering Cape Ann women in the quarries.
Monica Lawton, and I am here to read a passage from Jonathan Bayliss's Gloucester book. But a couple of definitions to help with understanding of this passage. The North Village is the name for Pigeon Cove. Dogtown is Gloucester. Cape Gloucester Forge Company is the Cape Ann Tool Company, and Powerhouse Cove is down near the Granite Pier, which we'll visit on Sunday, on the Sunday morning walk. Okay, best of all, to his ears, North Village, the most charming ward in all of Dogtown, erewhile denuded of trees, as rape by pirates and quarrymen, but now sprucely redressed with green and white paint. Its naked, dusty slashes of quarry works, except for the pits themselves, readorned with shrubs and lawns. North Village still tolerated a daily routine of deafening bangs from the mechanized hammers of the Cape Gloucester Forge Company, the closed dye plant founded as a tool-making smithy for the granite industry, but long since employed in forging steel parts for manufacturers all over the country. That small community of craftsmen, laborers, shopkeepers, and clerks, less than a mile north of Powerhouse Cove, tucked into the vale of a rust granite quay in yet another tiny hewn stone harbor, where one of the other quarry railroads loaded granite onto coastal vessels broad of beam and blunt of bow. North Village had been a gathering place of single-masted stone sloops, when Dogtown Harbor was a concentration of nobly battered, two-masted fishing schooners. Save for the raucous, obsolescent forge, now so anomalous in the waterside hollow, alongside a few moored lobster boats, and below the most decorous of dwellings, North Village had irrevocably resigned the swarming, sweaty class of work. Most of its present inhabitants lived on an income previously or never earned, or else they commuted for good salary somewhere down the line they lived beyond this end of. Jonathan Bayliss.
I'm Theo MacGregor, and I'll be reading words by Clara Knowlton Swan as reported in Roger Martin's Rockport Remembered, an Oral History. I've edited out some of the account for time purposes. I was born and brought up at 60 Granite Street, right in the midst of the Pigeon Hill Granite Company operations. You don't hear much of anything about the Pigeon Hill Granite Company on their wharf, but it was a very busy place. 106 Granite Street was the company office building, and they had a tenement above it with rooms for the quarry workers. On the Pigeon Hill wharf, they cut paving blocks. There were paving huts all along the side of the wharf. There was also a stone crusher and the engine house, which Kitty Fitz much later made into a house. Some of her relatives used to tell Kitty that some big storm would wash that wharf away, and she said it would last as long as she would, and it did. Kitty's now dead, and the wharf's still there. This was an entirely different place from what's now called Granite Pier. It was a smaller wharf. I'm somewhat bothered that people only know about the Rockport Granite Company, and I'm so happy that people will now get to know a bit about the Pigeon Hill Granite Company. Next to that wharf was a pebbly beach that we practically lived on in the summertime. Used to run over the pebbles in our bare feet. We went barefoot all summer. And at high tide, we went swimming. Low tide was all full of seaweed. When we went swimming as girls, we just wore an old dress. I was a teenager before I had a real bathing suit. We even wore stockings. The Pigeon Hill Granite Company owned Steel Derrick Quarry then. The granite came down to the Pigeon Hill Granite Company wharf on railroad tracks by gravity on big flat cars. The track went right by our house, and each car had a man at a brake, some kind of a rod on a stand, and he had to put that rod in it to act as a brake. And it was really quite dangerous. And the company had a man in a little hut right along Granite Street. And when there was a granite car coming down, he'd come out and wave his flag. That empty granite car then would be pulled back up the hill to the quarry by 4 big horses. The round the Cape electric car went by that spot, and every time they came by from Lanesville, they'd stop right in front of our house. The conductor would jump off, look up the hill to see if a car might be coming, and then jump back on the electric car and off they'd go. And that happened every time they went by. I don't remember hearing the drilling in the quarries, but I do remember the blasts. Anyone who was near when they blasted got under cover. When they were ready to blast in the quarries, they'd blow a horn. Everybody took cover when they heard that horn because of the granite chips that flew out when they blasted. And when my father became captain of the Moody, which was a steam-propelled barge of sorts, the company wanted him near the wharf, and they had him rent the house at 60 Granite Street, so he'd sort of be on call. Shortly before he was killed, we bought the place. The average quarry worker got paid $10 a week. And my father was one of the highest paid people in the company because as captain of the Moody, he got $25 a week. And that was a big salary in those days. One day when the Moody was moored next to a large ship in Boston Harbor, my father noticed a detached wooden pilot house on the ship's deck. He inquired about it, and it turned out they didn't need the thing. So he bought it on the spot, thinking it would make a nice playhouse for us girls. He used the Moody's derrick, usually used to hoist granite blocks, to put it aboard the then empty Moody. They brought it back to Pigeon Cove and brought it up the hill from the wharf on a granite car to our backyard. That old pilot house was a playhouse for me and my sisters. But when our chickens got broody, my father put them on the lower bunk, which didn't make me too happy. One day, the Moody was in Jonesport, Maine, loading some pink granite, which the company had gotten an order for. They were loading when the shipboard derrick broke, fell, hit my father on the head, and killed him. He was 49 years old, 6'2", and a big man. Not fat, just a big, broad-shouldered man. That was in 1915, and it was a shock to the whole town. The whole town shut down for his funeral. He carried his own insurance policy, but there was nothing from my mother at his death from the company. They said he was the captain of the ship, and he was responsible for the whole thing. Thank you.
I'm Chris Leahy. Excuse me. I'm Chris Leahy, and I'm going to be reading from Barbara Urkula's Hammers on Stone. If you don't know that work and are interested in this subject matter, it's a classic, maybe the classic, so I urge you certainly to read that. So just a brief passage. One of the great things the Pigeon Hill Granite Company did was to complete an inclined railroad from their two big pits, Upper Pigeon Hill, now still derrick, and Parker's, down to their new breakwater and pier constructed on Colburn's Point just below Granite Street. The newspaper of the day called the railroad a gravitation road and predicted that many cars would hurtle into the sea as they went down the steep incline with loads of stone. In April 1874, the company was setting in the rails of the new railroad, and they seem to have opened the road shortly after that without any fanfare. A flagman was stationed at the street to warn people that a stone car was about to cross, ascending or descending. Dan McIsaac was the brakeman on the Pigeon Hill Granite Company Railway. A tall man, 6 feet at least, he was powerful enough to hold down the bar brake going downhill. Coming back, Alec Burke, a teamster, guided his big horses to pull the empty cars to the quarries once more. It was in February 1875 that a stone car high up near Upper Pigeon Hill pit, not far from the cutting shed, rammed into an empty car ahead of it, sending the second car forward with a terrible spurt. It broke its brake and hurtled down the hill, shot across Granite Street, and zoomed clear to the end of the wharf. There it leaped 30 feet into the air and fell with a tremendous splash beneath the surface of the water. Many huge granite blocks fell off the cars, especially in that section where there was a slight dip below Granite Street on the way to the wharf. Sometimes the men came down and drilled the blocks, breaking them on the spot into a size that could be lifted. But most of the time, they left them where they fell. Many of those old blocks have been incorporated into house foundations built in that vicinity later on. One measures 13½ feet by 5 feet and is 12 inches thick.
Oh, yes. That's fine.
Do you want me to
You
lower
can see
this?
the top of my head and my eyebrows.
Do you want me
They're
to?
charming.
Do you want me to lower this?
It's okay, because then
Okay.
you'll just be jumping up and down. I'll peek over it. Hello, I'm Martha Fox, and I am very fortunate to have lived most of my childhood and adult life right here in Pigeon Cove. And I feel particularly lucky.
I'm gonna lower this for you.
Okay, thank you.
We can raise it
There
again.
I am. I feel particularly lucky to have spent so much time in and around our local quarries. So I wrote this poem in tribute to my favorite of these very special places. I know each of you, I imagine each of you have your own favorite, but this is a poem for mine. Steel derrick quarry, autumn. Working Sundays beyond the ledge top, some townsmen and my father spent one September putting in seedlings of hemlock and fir. They lifted shovels full of dirt, rooting a meadow with young trees, packing soil back by hand. On paths rutted by rain, I walk these afternoons. Veteran of quarry seasons, I know fall's consolations. Collage of foliage on the wood's floor, gleaming copper, amber, and golden sassafras. Sumac flames, gray cloudscapes of cliffs quivering on the surface. In the forest hollow, are traces of train tracks, rusted as leaves. When blasting shifted granite to building stone and aggregate, men went deaf, machines blunt, hammering wedges. Flat cars crushed a mile of brush, hauling their weight down to the pier. I come here for the echoes, for the familiar mist of water meeting cooler air. It begins as breath of resting fish, fins shifting slightly in sun refracting off stone below. The air murmurs of underground springs seeping slowly. I slow, imagining the flicker of remembered men, of my spectral father, counting trees along ledge tops. The evergreen grove is meadow again. The granite has gone to pavers. Schooners sailed off to museums up the coast. At the edge, I pocket a pine cone and picture summer's children learning to swim.
Okay? No, I'm fine. I'm Rosalie Hughes. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from Mary Pucci Couchman's contribution to Rockport Remembered, an oral history compiled by Roger Martin and published in 1997. Mary Pucci Couchman was born in Folly Cove in 1922, the fifth child of Emilio Pucci and Paola Sodini Pucci, who came from villages near Lucca, Italy, close to the famous Carrara marble pits. Her father came through Ellis Island and worked first as a waiter in New York and then at a limestone in Sandusky, Ohio, and then he was sent to open a new granite quarry near Folly Cove. And before he came to Folly Cove, he went back to Italy and convinced Paola to come with him. He'd been writing to her for 3 years to try to get her to come. What follows are excerpts from her contribution to Rockport Remembered. My father was a blaster detonator and a steam drill operator. The Folly Cove quarries were shallow, but with nice flat edges sloping down to the ocean. They could easily load the granite onto barges. The company erected a barracks for the workers. My mother and Mrs. Bianchini were the cooks for about 40 Folly Cove quarry workers, among them a group of Turks. I'm assuming they were Turks. My mother called them Turks. They were Muslims, wore turbans, and dressed in flowing white robes. They hated the cold and the food, and they bowed to the east several times a day to say their prayers. I think they only stayed a year. The workers got their drinking water from that scuzzy pond right at the edge of Locust Grove Cemetery. My father came down with typhoid fever once, and my mother always said it was the water. The Folly Cove Pier is entirely man-made. In the whaling days, they hauled whales ashore about where the lobster restaurant is now to be flensed out and became known as Blubber Hollow. After several years in the barracks, my mother finally said she was pretty sick and tired of living in those barracks, and if my father didn't provide better housing for her, she was going back to Italy. So we bought her a house on Granite Street, but it was cold and drafty, an old fish shack, so that he rented a house down in Blubber Hollow, where the trolley used to turn around. I was born in that little house, probably the last living native of Blubber Hollow. When I was about 11, we moved to Gott Avenue. That's where I got my Anglo-Saxon surrogate mother, Lizzie McClellan. In those days, we were taught to call our elders aunt or uncle as a sign of respect. Lizzie McClellan was always Aunt Lizzie. We used the Italian language in our home, my father thinking we should keep our heritage alive, and when we got to school, we'd pick up English. Lizzie was a natural teacher, very smart, with a tremendous fund of knowledge. She'd gather us the day before Memorial Day, and we'd cut lilacs and iris and put them in buckets of water. The next day, we'd trudge up to Locust Grove Cemetery and place them on the graves. Even here, she taught us things, like not to walk on the graves and to be quiet. It's interesting to note that most Italians never changed their names when they came to this country. They were quite independent and proud of their heritage. I remember after World War II ended, the Italians were perceived as going communist, and people thought they were presenting a threat. My father said not to worry about it. He said Italians were no threat to democracy. I went to the Story School in Pigeon Cove and stayed there through the 8th grade. When it closed in the 1980s, I had a grandson in the 1st grade, so I told him I'd opened it and he'd closed it. I remember that if we brought home a report card that said we were, quote, inclined towards mischief under the deportment heading, we were in deep trouble. Our parents had an ingrained sense of respect for authority, and this was passed on to us in no uncertain terms. You respected whichever teacher or adult corrected you, and we all respected anyone who'd been smart and lucky enough to have a formal education beyond high school. When I was a youngster in the Pigeon Cove woods, they were laced with paths and grout piles next to the small motions. We thought of them as woodland eyesores back then. Halibut Point was considered particularly ugly, with its piles of grout and rubble, as well as old rusting machines and tools. I remember my father telling me later on that a man had bought it and was going to make a park out of it. Some people resent that the area was turned to a state park, but I recall there was fear of condominiums being built there, and I think a state park is more desirable than condos. We did a lot of blueberrying in the summer. We could sell them to the summer boarders over on the avenues for 25 cents a quart, and that was considered big money. You'd find your own best spot for berries, but you didn't tell anyone else about it. I used to pick right in the poison ivy because I wasn't allergic to it. We also picked blackberries, and our mother would mix them in with blueberries for a pie and sometimes squeeze them and add the juices to our drinking water because the water was terrible in August. My older brother loved repairing old cars known as junks, and this became the bane of my father's existence. Once while driving around with his friends, they found several gallons of home-distilled whiskey tucked in among the rocks down in Folly Cove, waiting to be picked up by the bootleggers. My mother gave them impromptu lectures on the evils of drinking unknown whiskey instead of good grain alcohol. Making whiskey was one of our cottage industries at the time. Most of us preferred our swimming in the quarries because the water was a little warmer than at the beaches. We'd go ocean swimming at Halibut Point and rinse the salt off in the quarry on the way home. One summer day at the Babson pit, a group of us girls stopped off for our usual rinse-off, and Mr. Shapiro, who lived at the end of Gott Avenue, had brought a group of his friends to the pit for a swim, and one of them was naked. In those days, girls were more modest, and we reluctantly and with much grumbling went on our way and ran into Lottie Pratt Parody. We told her what we'd found at the quarry, and she indignantly strode to the quarry's edge and aggressively told the Shapiro party to leave the area. Mr. Shapiro announced authoritatively that his naked guest was Dr. Gregory Pincus of Clark University, who was about to become renowned for the research on a pill which would someday control the entire population of the world. To which Lottie replied, in all her Yankee firmness, Dr. Pinkass or Dr. Redass better get out of here or I'll call the law. Many years later, that very Dr. Pincus became famous as the father of the birth control pill. One great thing about growing up here was that you played with kids of all kinds of different nationalities, and everyone got along with everyone. The Scandinavians, Irish, Italian, Portuguese were all determined to become Americans. No one would ever have thought of introducing a second language into the school system. People kept their ethnicity, within their families, but made no public demands on others to accept it. Mary Pucci Couchman spent her career as a pediatrician in the Midwest. She died in 2014 and is buried in Locust Grove Cemetery.
You got it high enough.
I don't know.
I'm Peter Littlefield. This is also a passage from Jonathan Bayliss's Gloucester book, which is the second, I think, in his tetralogy, Gloucester Man. The speaker is Huck Salter, a fictional character based on Jonathan Bayliss's friend, Rockport artist Roger Martin. Of Portuguese and Finnish descent, Martin grew up among the fishing and quarrying that inspired his art. Placerville, which you'll hear mentioned, is a mining town in California. My grandfather was a quarry blacksmith, Huck said. But like everyone else living at the end of the past, he too ended up in the carriage trade as farrier to the gentry who still kept horses on the Cape. That's the moral price you pay to stick it out here. Huck's lean jaw tugged on an unlighted pipe, but hardly paused, making the most of a fresh off-island ear. He went on. Yet in Granddad's time, the village had been as ugly as Placerville from ruthless strip mining. They tried to sell anything granite but the noise. Road contractors bought the chips, and the dust went for fertilizer. Not until 60 years ago did people start planting shade trees along some of the naked streets. Now there's sumac and scrub oak sprouted from the grout strewn all over the land between the abandoned pits. Unfortunately, everything's getting nicer every year, and the cost of individualism keeps rising. Sally and I could never have afforded to live here if I hadn't inherited my father's mortgage. That last line, that's something I can relate to. I think a lot of people can relate to that on Cape Ann. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Gerard Roy, and I'm reading from a 1923 book by Charles Boardman Hawes. It's called Gloucester by Land and Sea. Wherever you go, by the paths that wind back and forth on the northern end of the Cape, you will see, as from time to time you leave the woods, lonely derricks against the sky and piles of waste stone, and now and then, in some utterly unexpected place, you will come on a deserted quarry hole with a deep pool of still, green water far below. The quarries, like the fisheries, have their grim tales. There is the story of a man who was standing by a derrick when the cable parted and the broken end whipped off the top of his head. They used to say, too, that a certain doctor on the Cape, who had a reputation for skill in setting broken bones, got his marked ability very naturally from the extensive practice that the quarries afforded him. And there is always present the more insidious side of stone cutting, occupational disease caused by the white dust that fills the air and lies like snow on the men's clothes. But the stone cutters are a good sort, and there are numerous yarns of quite another kind. They still tell of the day when a blustering, bullying foreman tried one too many times to browbeat an immense immigrant who had endured the man's attacks so long and so calmly that no one suspected the fierceness that lurked behind his phlegmatic exterior. The moment came at last when the foreman's abuse aroused completely the fellow's slow temper. He leapt upon the foreman, one hand grasping the nape of the neck, the other the slack of his breeches, and lifting him bodily, and holding him out over the edge of the quarry pit. With 80 feet of empty air between his victim and broken stone below, he shook him as a puppy shakes a shoe and roared, "What you think if I open my hands now? What you think if I open my hands now?"
Hi, I'm Susanna Natti, and I'm going to be reading from The Quarry Adventure by Lee Kingman, published in 1951. Lee Kingman was my mother and a children's book author. 4 of her books were set in Lanesville, drawing on the stories my father, Robert Natti, would tell about his Finnish American family, the village, and the quarries. The granite industry was still a fresh memory. To set the scene, Garnet, a cosseted, lonely, recently orphaned only child, has been sent to live with her guardian aunt in Annisquam. When her aunt is injured in a fall, Garnet is temporarily taken into a large and boisterous Finnish-American family. It's hard for Garnet to fit in, and she finds she's a fish out of water, often misunderstanding what's going on. Mr. Sirinen, the head of the family, has suffered a quarry accident and is laid up, so he, too, is feeling that the world has been turned upside down. As an act of kindness, he confides in her his hurt and confusion and anger about the quarry accident, for which he's been unjustly blamed, and begins his conversation with this passage about cutting stone. He led her to the cemetery stone wall, where they rested and waited for the streetcar. Behind them, the ocean winked and wallowed, and a tiny breeze darted about in the morning, which was working up to be a hot one. "Well, let me tell you while we wait," said Father, "that I am a skilled stonecutter. It has been my work, even before I left Finland, to travel to America. I know stone so well, I can find the rift just by looking at it. I can tell how it will split without even touching it. Once I've drilled a hole and put in a wedge, I can tell just what note it will make before I even tap it with a hammer. I can give one blow, and someone will say 2 or 3 blows more to split that stone. But I will walk away and listen. Listen until, ever so faintly, I hear that slow, rippling cracking of the stone as the split starts and spreads. I walk back, and without laying a finger on the stone, snap, it is in 2 pieces, just as I wanted it to be. So well do I know stone."
I'm George Sibley. I'm going to be reading from Jonathan Bayliss's Gloucester book, a piece entitled "Wat Sibber at a Party at Pigeon Cove." In the piece, the character of Wat Sibber is based on my father, Bill Sibley. My dad and Jonathan met first through their wives, and then became better acquainted as fellow observers of the Gloucester scene over the years. My father owned and captained a 40-foot fishing vessel, which he crewed alone. In Jonathan's rendering, my dad's boat is named the Motion. By quarrying terminology, a motion is a very small quarry, usually not much more than 2 men could excavate and operate. There's a delightful line in the piece likening the work of digging these motions to the construction of a boat. My father had constructed his own boat of wood and worked it as a one-man fishing vessel all his life. When I first got my boat, I dubbed her the Weather Breeder, because I like to call a spade a spade. But fishermen are superstitious, you know, and they got me to change her name. But it didn't make much difference. If I don't sneak out in the fog or dead of night, it still breezes up the minute I go outside the breakwater. So for the sake of my colleagues, most days I stay ashore and listen to the weather forecasts. Always plenty to do. Fixing to go fishing while I wait for the prices to go up to the slave wage level. So the name you changed it to wasn't any luckier? Now she's registered as the Motion. Watt's explanation was well honed for the edification of curious city slickers. My old man always used to quote Isaiah to me. Look unto the rock whence ye are hewn, and to the hole of the pit whence ye are digged. He was always bidding me to get over my adultery of fishing. And if I wouldn't listen to him about a sensible trade in carpentry ashore, at least I should remember the land of my mother up at Taraville. Her people were farmers from the beginning, but in the off-season, during the great granite rush, like everyone else up this way on the Cape, her grandfather used to take out some stone and split paving blocks in his spare time, with only one helper at the most. He'd find a ledge up in the hills, scrape off the topsoil, set up a mast and boom, which they called a stick, and start his own private pit, like digging a boat. All through the woods and along the old roads, there were these little shallow quarries, motions in their lingo. In some places, slabs had been motioned out of the bare rocks, even right down along the shore, which the pilgrims think are Greek theater seats to watch shipwrecks from. Making motions was like drilling for oil in a pasture, except you had to work just as hard at the end as you did in the beginning, and it was never any bonanza. The same way with me and the holes I make in the water. Most of the time, I can't get enough fish to hire any help. So I stick up my own rig and work my own hours. Too bad it only got a 1-watt power engine. Can't go very far in my motion before it's time to turn around and come home for tea. I should have christened her the slow motion. Captain Sibber evidently trusted that the wit of his entertainment would sooner or later dawn on anyone who stayed in Dogtown long enough to learn of his reputation as the skipper of a one-man dragger who so loved fishing that occasionally he hired out himself in Motion as pilot and workboat for odd little towing or research jobs to support the privilege of unmaking a fortune in Dogtown's uncommercial fishing industry. They say those motions in the woods around Purdyville are filled with water or covered with catbrier now, he continued. But I wouldn't rightly know, because I haven't strolled up there since I was in grandma school. Watt didn't look like much of a walker. His arms and legs were as thick as oak trees. We used to go for the blueberries. A lot of people still do, but not the kids. They don't go anywhere they can't ride. Nowadays, boys won't even take girls for a walk.
Because I want to introduce you to what's going to be the real topic of the women in the quarries, the Cape Ann women in the quarries. I'm delighted to present what's been a very long research project for me that's lasted almost 60 years of my life. I think I'm 75, so you can go back to 15. Like, well, what are quarries like? Who are the people that went through it? And all of the wonderful readings by both men and women have really brought out the difficulty of quarry life, the difficulty of men in the quarries who did hard work with a hard granite. So I came up with this topic of Cape Ann women in the quarries, of an austere tenderness, of what's it been like for women in the quarries, not just to paint, not just to swim, not just to sculpt, but what about Cape Ann women in the quarries? It's a national question. There never was an owner of a granite quarry that made $1 million, and more complicated, there's only one woman in New York who ran a granite quarry. So this makes a very narrow thread. This is either Virginia or Clara Cleves, and how she enters the quarries of Cape Ann, how she's removed from the quarries of Cape Ann, is what I want to speak to you about, and what we're left with. So please, I apologize for having my back to you, but it makes the work a little bit easier. So this is Cape Ann women in the quarries, austere tenderness. This is an oft-repeated view of people standing atop the Keystone Bridge looking into Flatledge Quarry. It's after 1892 when the granite building in the back, which was the Rockport Granite Company's corporate headquarters, is built. But this really represents just how close and how far women were. They would go out of the house where they had cooked, where they had tended to the children, and stand at the quarry and look at their husbands, their brothers, their fathers, their sons, but they never set foot in the quarry itself. But the very first known writing on the Cape Ann quarries was by Harriet Martineau, who was English. She was a feminist, the first female sociologist. She actually wrote and sold more than Charles Dickens did. And she came to the United States in the 1930s and writes a 2-volume edition of Society in America. And she said, coming through Pigeon Cove, coming by the street that we're on right now, saying, you know, there's granite everywhere. People are just elated that they can put it out by the side of the road and have people come by to buy it. And just imagine how great it is to make buildings out of stone instead of wood. They're going to last forever. At that time, there was the land and the sea. And this is the photographer Charles Cleves photographing his wife, Clara, on the left, holding a flower out to his very diligently observing daughter, Virginia. This is on Pigeon Hill, just across the street from where we are. And it really represents what the sort of circumstance. Quarrying is going on, but haying is going on. You know, and sunsets at night, which were so beautiful. He really captures it quite nicely in this image. Here again is Clara, his wife, on the left, and his daughter Virginia on the right. Virginia now is of an age where she's gone off to college. This is still, it's around 1918. To the far left, behind the bush, you can see just a tease of the Sandy Bay breakwater. Okay? I've included these two because the real issue is what happens at this point. So I found a glass plate negative and made a print of this woman sitting under the Keystone Bridge in the middle of the quarrying world. Now, a fact that you may not know is that no one walked in underneath the bridge from the wharf side. It was all about granite going off. The stone carts were loaded, they were weighed. The men themselves came down after signing in to the left-hand side of the picture. Out of the picture, there was a wooden ladder that they would climb down. No one, it was verboten for anyone to walk in under the bridge. Yet here was this woman, you know, dressed in a white shirt, white blouse, sitting on a rock. And what was this all about? It's a close-up of her. She's walked in, she's taken her jacket off. It's a pleated blouse. I really am undecided about whether it's Virginia or Clara. I don't know. And for a long time that's all I could say. There's a woman sitting under the, you know, she's sitting on the rock, under the bridge, and she has no right to be there. And then I found Charles Cleves' workbook for making postcards. So you have to understand, it was a great amusement for summer visitors to be able to take a postcard home. I have to send to someone, look where I am, dear somebody, I'm under this bridge, I'm nearby. And Charles founded the Rockport Photo Bureau, which became the largest. Many of the historic postcards that you see of Rockport and Gloucester were done by Charles Cleves. So, okay, this is all nice. And then I found that in the print that he used to make the postcard, he had blackened out where his wife is sitting. And here's the postcard. And you can see in the corner in here where the black is, back and forth, okay? Yeah, so, you know, so in telling people about Cape Ann women in the quarries, there's been a really interesting reaction. Without telling anybody anything, they say, oh, that's an interesting topic. I never thought about women in the quarries. I'd really like to hear about that. And then when I went through the process of saying, here's the view, he erases her, you know, from the picture, They say, did he divorce her? Did she divorce him? I mean, how could he dare to do that, right? I had a friend last night said, well, it's just artistic license. And I don't think it's any of that. I think it's that he really wanted, for a certain view. Here's the actual page in his postcard makeup book, okay? Where it shows the print at the top where she's been erased, and then at the bottom where the postcard's been published. Now, is the Cape Ann Music School? I don't remember the name. It's young children that go to a summer camp. They went under the bridge, and they went to try to find the exact spot where she sat on the boom derrick mast. And this was 2 weeks ago. So it's a contemporary. The neat thing is the bridge is still there. The view is still there. You can go and see where she sat. Okay, but she's gone. So that led me over time to look for other references that might have been happening at the same time. The postcard was done pre-World War I. This is a painting by Child Hassan, pre-World War I, called At the Top of Folly Cove. There are 3 paintings that he did that are in this style where it's still kind of in a classical, the myth of nature and the myth of raw nature is still ever present. The woman in the back is in a quarry pool. It could be emotion. All of this is to bring this as a question to you. Okay? Ellen Day Hale, in the 1880s, comes on a train from Boston with a group of other female friends who have been learning how to do etchings. Gabriel de Clements, who was was her partner, comes on the trip, and it's published by Harper's Magazine. It's an intellectual conceit, where one paragraph is very rhapsodic about the nature of Cape Ann and the beauty of it, and the next paragraph is very industrial of how much granite's being shipped out, how it's the gold of Cape Ann. The whole trip was probably paid for by the Rockport Granite Company, although there's no record. This view of the Rockport Quarry is by Gabriel DeVoe Clements. And in the writing to the right, which she does this in 1984, and it's the first time that Harper's Magazine has experimented with a metal plate rather than wood. And it's a raving success. They love it. They love it so much. Gabriel Clements says that they give her a full page. The original print is at the San Diego Historical Society. There's a copy at Cape Ann Museum. There are copies that have been around at auctions. Gabriel goes on to say that she goes to Paris to the black and white exhibition, and the quarry in Rockport, Massachusetts is given significantly good note. So there's a case where a woman who came into the quarries, ostensibly to record what it looked like, and a piece of art lasts and still continues to last now. And she writes the note, handwritten note, in 1932. This is a great, This is from the Harper's magazine. I'd like to read this to you. This is in the tradition when people never gave their names on trips or in certain articles. They'd have nom de plumes. So Anastasia and Bessie are Gabriel DeVoe Clements and Ellen Day Hale, probably. A giant made prisoner. Anastasia stared about her, taking mental notes of the relations of light and shade, and trying to fix in her mind the action of the workmen. Bessie was not so cool. Something oppressed her here, and she quite lost the happy tranquility which she had felt 5 minutes before in the straggling country road among the peaceful winter gardens. She felt as if in these few minutes she had come out of the happy New England which she knew and loved, a little country which, with all its faults, is civilized and human enough, into the midst of some great workshop of nature, outside human ways and human knowledge. Here were the dark rocks which they told her had lasted since the beginning of the world and which had seen more frightful changes than Betsy could imagine. And here at work, among them was a magical instrument, the dynamiting, a giant made prisoner who was fighting the rocks with another unnatural force, even stronger than ours. One of the limits is this is a world that's so elusive to us. Okay? Here is, I included this. This is the only photograph that I've ever seen that actually shows a moment of an explosion going off. I'm not reading about it, I'm not thinking about it, I'm not hearing it, I'm seeing it. Okay? I just thought that was very cool. This is an etching that accompanies the article in Harper's. This is quite literally as you go down Granite Street and you round the corner down by the wharfs to go to the bottom wharf where the landing is, where boats go in and out, is just to the right of these oxen team. Okay? So these stories are very long and very old. And in looking for, well, what is there? If Charles wiped his wife out from being in the quarry, what's been left? And painting is certainly something that has greatly occupied people. This is Margaret Howard Yetton White, a painting called The Tub Tippers, which is her view of paving cutters at Granite Pier, okay, with all the granite sheds going up top. And the tubs, which was, when they first did this, people made money from making the wooden tubs. This is a painting by Irma Wheeler, who was known as the wheelwright of the quarries. This was exhibited at the Trident Gallery, is on loan from Michael Wheeler, her son. Just fabulous. Of course, Barbara Urkula was the mainmast of saving. She put the finger in the dike of the loss of memory around the quarries of Cape Ann. At the top, I want to read to you is a quote from Ina Hahn to me saying, "Beautiful show, beautiful work. Thank you for reinforcing what those of us lucky enough see or swim in daily." Ina Hahn. This is from 2007. See, it moves away from having men in the quarries and women in the quarries to what is masculine and what is feminine, how are the forces coming out? It was after seeing my work that Ina took the time to then realize what had been a very lifelong passion for her, which is maybe one of the closest things that we have for Cape Ann women in the quarry, which was the quarry dances that she started. Okay? It was upon her passing that her daughter Lisa continued the quarry dances. And on the right is a photograph. Let me see if I kept both in. Good. So this is from Quarry Dance 6. This is one of the quarry dancers dipping down into the water, and I've superimposed at the bottom a photograph of one of the quarries, of that closeness. So, and I've only come to realize that it's a question of the masculine and feminine. We're doing fine, Catherine. It's 7:54. We're going to finish on 8 o'clock. I was prepared to stand up there with just a cutout of the woman. So I thank everyone who read so passionately. It's so great. It was, I think, in 2011 that this woman came to me and said, "I want you to take me into the quarries. I want you to print my work." And I said, "Get out of here." I said, "I don't have time for this." And she persisted. And so I said, "Okay, we'll go to Flat Ledge Quarry." Now you have to understand, I didn't know that you could walk in underneath the bridge. Okay? The first time I went to the quarry, I parked up on Quarry Road. I went down over the ledge and I basically slid down 45 feet. And then I went, I could park on Beach Street and, walk in underneath. So I'm very sensitive to the issue of, do you have the right to walk in under here or not? This is the cover. So finally, it's like Susan made it down the hardscrabble with me, and she's sitting here tonight. She didn't break her ankle. She didn't twist an arm. And we started for a series of a time of, we go to the quarry, and I would take a photograph from my viewpoint, and she began to paint hers. And it became a wonderful collaboration. Okay? This collaboration, this is from 2018. By this time, we've moved through a number. We did a program in 2016 on the resilient landscape of Cape Ann, on quarries in the North Pigeon Cove area and the resilience. This was for the Thoreau Society. This is Susan to the left and me to the right in her silk painting. We started doing collaging together on it. We also traveled up to Barrie, Vermont. Whoops, let me go back here. Okay. Took a day trip up, and Susan photographed me in the quarry, and then I photographed her in the quarry. I've always wanted abandoned quarries. I felt I could get closer to the spirit of the rock and the spirit of the men who have passed. And Susan and I have worked, we've worked. I'm really grateful for our collaboration, okay, as artists. This led me to a exhibition called Persephone, the Unspeakable Girl. It's you drive by it when you go by the bridge and you cross the Keystone Bridges. That bridge, which is crossed by thousands of cars daily, that wall has such a feminine presence to it. It's a wall that would have been destroyed if the granite company had its way, but they needed to keep a road for men and women to come from the train station over to Pigeon Cove. So I mentioned there's only one woman who was known to have been a granite owner. I've spent a lot of time in Barrie, Vermont, and I want to end with a photograph that is just never going to happen in Cape Ann. Cape Ann granite is very old. It's very good for paving stones. Some dimension stone can be taken out. I'm going to show you the working hands of someone who has broken the mold. This is Heather Milne Ritchie, who lives in Barrie, Vermont, and is the first and only granite sculptor in the man's world. Okay? These are her hands. You will never see this in Cape Ann. There is not the type of rock. We have a different legacy. We have a legacy of this tension between the land and the ocean, basically male-dominated. And I thought about how to say, let's say, keep at it. Keep swimming, keep painting, keep sculpting, keep filming, keep at it. Because you're keeping, through your words, women, ladies, you're keeping what is a lost tradition alive. Barbara Urkula took a truckload of tools to the Cape Ann Museum in the 1990s. I mean, her wagon was down, the bumper was right down to the ground. They didn't know what to do with it. In 2013, I got to hold each one of the tools. So there is an acuity that you can bring. The fact is that Charles Clee simply decided to kick his wife out of the picture. And I thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much, Les. Another round of applause for our readers.